The silence in CEO Lee Jinwoo's mansion was as heavy as his grief. A widower with an empire in his hands and a son, Lee Jun, who had withdrawn from the world. Jinwoo was a man of ice. No nanny ever lasted. Until Kim Min-ji, a young woman with a pure heart and gentle smile, accepted the challenge. Distrustful, Jinwoo installed cameras throughout the house, determined to find the flaw that all the others had. He wanted the truth, but what he saw... Oh, what he saw made him break down in tears. It wasn't the neglect he expected, but a scene that melted his frozen heart. Min-ji wasn't just caring for his son. She was loving him, treating him as if he were her own, and this truth, captured by the cold lenses, was the most beautiful and painful he could have imagined. Tears streamed down Lee Jinwoo's face, warm and unexpected, a long, dry river suddenly finding its bed again. He hadn't cried since his wife's funeral, and the sensation was strange, almost painful in its intensity. On the screen, Kim Min-ji, the young nanny he had hired with so much distrust, was sitting on the floor of his son, Lee Jun's room, not in a distant chair, not distracted by her phone, but right there, at his level with a storybook in her hands. Her voice was soft, melodious, and Jun's eyes, once empty and dull, now followed her every word with a long-forgotten curiosity. The boy, who had barely spoken since his mother's death, who flinched at touch and had withdrawn from the world, was laughing. A small, almost inaudible laugh, like the tinkling of wind chimes on a calm day, but a laugh nonetheless. He pointed to the figures in the book, and Min-ji responded with a mother's patience, explaining every detail, every color, every character, with a dedication that seemed to transcend mere professional obligation. Jinwoo felt a lump in his throat. He had installed those cameras to hunt for flaws, to confirm his worst suspicions, to find the negligence that all the other nannies had displayed. But what he found was a kindness so genuine, so selfless, that it left him speechless. It was as if a ray of sunshine had invaded the darkness of his home, and he, the guardian of that darkness, didn't know how to react. Guilt hit him hard. He had judged her, he had spied on her, and she, in return, was giving his son what he, the father himself, could no longer give: unconditional love and mindful attention. Why? What kind of person was Kim Min-ji? Was it all a facade? A perfect performance for the cameras that she somehow knew existed? Doubt, a persistent parasite, still tried to cling to his mind, but it was suffocated by the irrefutable evidence before his eyes. He couldn't look away. The night advanced, and Jinwoo remained there, glued to those images. He watched Min-ji prepare Jun's dinner, not just following the prescribed diet, but cutting vegetables into fun shapes, singing a soft song as he ate. He watched her help him with his bath, with a tenderness that reminded him of happy days with his late wife, a painful echo of a past he thought he had buried. She brushed Jun's teeth with the same delicacy with which she combed his hair, and the boy, once resistant to any touch, allowed himself to be cared for. Hours turned into days. Jinwoo, once a relentless workaholic, found himself increasingly distracted in his meetings. His mind wandered to the screens in his office, imagining what Min-ji and Jun might be doing. He could no longer focus on numbers, profits, or mergers. The image of his son, smiling, even if just a small smile, was more powerful than any financial statement. Jinwoo's office, once a sanctuary of work, became an observatory. He watched Jun, who previously refused to leave his room, now exploring the house with Min-ji, playing in the garden, even attempting to draw. The drawings were childish scribbles, but Min-ji praised them as works of art, hanging them on the refrigerator with a pride that seemed genuine, as if every crayon stroke were a treasure. She took him for walks in the park, something Jinwoo hadn't done for years, and the sound of Jun's laughter, once a distant ghost, now filled the house. But there were moments that tested his faith, moments that made him hold his breath. One day, June had a terrible nightmare. His screams echoed through the mansion, and Jinwoo, frozen in his office, watched the images. Minji rushed to the room. Instead of turning on the light and scolding him or calling Jinwoo, she hugged him, murmuring sweet words, gently rocking him until his crying subsided. She stayed with him, sitting by the bed, singing an old lullaby until the sun began to peek through the window, painting the sky in rosy hues. Jinwoo saw everything, and with each passing second, the wall of ice in his heart cracked a little more, revealing a vulnerability he thought he had lost forever. He didn't know what to do with this truth. Minji wasn't just a nanny. She was the light his son needed, the bridge that connected him back to the world. But what did that mean for him? For the man who had hidden behind his grief and his empire? The tension was palpable, not between him and Minji, but within himself. He watched her, no longer to find flaws, but to understand the miracle she was performing in his home, in his son, and, without him realizing it, in his own heart. Time, for Lee Jin-woo, had become a malleable entity, distorted by the lens of his security cameras. Hours of crucial meetings, once rigidly timed, now blurred into a haze as his mind wandered to the screens in his office. Financial reports, piles of urgent documents, lay untouched on his ebony desk, overshadowed by the image of his son, Lee Jun. Laughing, a laugh that he, the father, hadn't heard in years. Jin-woo's obsession deepened each day. He didn't eat properly, barely slept, and the sleep he did get was populated by fragmented dreams of a happy past and a present he barely recognized. Guilt, once a whisper, was now a deafening chorus. He had hired Minji to care for his son, but she was doing much more than that. She was rebuilding a world that he, in his grief, had allowed to crumble. On a sunny afternoon, Jin-woo watched Minji and June in the garden. She wasn't just supervising their play, she was participating. With dirt-stained hands, she taught June to plant small sunflower seeds, explaining the cycle of life with a simplicity that charmed the boy. June, who previously refused to touch anything but his toys, now held the soil with curiosity, his small fingers exploring its texture. Minji praised him for every small achievement, and June's smile, once rare and fleeting, now lingered on his face, lighting it up like the sun bathing the garden. Jin-woo felt a pang in his chest. He remembered his wife, who loved gardening, and how she had always dreamed of having a garden full of sunflowers. Minji, unknowingly, was fulfilling a piece of that dream, a piece he had forgotten in his own darkness. It was as if she had an invisible connection to the essence of his family, to what they had lost. The tension within Jin-woo was almost unbearable. He wanted to go down, wanted to join them, wanted to feel the earth between his fingers and the sun on his face. But shame paralyzed him. How could he appear now after weeks of secret observation? How could he face Minji, knowing he had spied on her, that he had doubted her kindness? Still, curiosity and a new, strange attraction pulled him. He began to subtly change his habits. Instead of going straight to his office upon arriving home, he would pass through the living room, accidentally overhearing June's laughter or Minji's soft voice reading a story. He found himself lingering in the hallway just to hear the sound of life she had brought back to his silent mansion. One evening, as Minji was preparing dinner for June, Jin-woo came down to the kitchen to get a glass of water. He saw her from behind, humming a melody, as she cut vegetables into star and moon shapes. June was sitting at the table, drawing with crayons, something he had never done before Minji arrived. The smell of fresh food and the sound of the melody filled the space, previously dominated by oppressive silence. Jin-woo stopped at the doorway, invisible to them. For a moment, he felt like an intruder in his own home. Minji turned to grab a seasoning and their eyes met. The startle was mutual. She froze, spoon in hand, and Jin-woo felt his heart race. He didn't know what to say. The words caught in his throat, the mask of a cold, distant CEO struggling to hold. "Mr. Lee," she said, her voice a little shaky but quickly regaining composure, "do you need anything?" He shook his head, forcing himself to speak. "No, I just came to get water." His voice sounded hoarse, strange even to his own ears. He took a glass, filled it, and drank, feeling her gaze on him. June, oblivious to the tension, continued to scribble. "Dinner will be ready soon," she added, turning back to the stove, but Jinwoo could feel the change in the atmosphere. The lightness, the joy, had diminished. His presence, even if brief, had broken the spell. He quickly retreated, feeling like a coward. That brief encounter had been more frightening than any board meeting. He had seen the purity of her work through the cameras, but confronting her in person was another matter. It was as if the truth he had witnessed demanded a response from him, an action, and he didn't know what it was. Back in his office, he sat down, the glass of water untouched on his desk. The screens still showed Minji and June, but now the image seemed different. He was no longer just a distant observer. He had become part of the equation, an element of disturbance. The question that tormented him was, why did she do it? Why this dedication, this love for a boy who wasn't hers, for a family that wasn't hers? Was it just her job? Or was there something deeper, something that he, in his life of business and losses, had forgotten? The wall of ice in his heart wasn't just cracking, it was melting, revealing a landscape of emotions he thought he had lost forever. And with the melting came the flood, not just of pain, but of a fragile and terrifying hope. He knew he couldn't go on like this. The truth he had discovered demanded action, a confession, or perhaps a new beginning. But how? How could he dismantle the web of distrust he himself had woven? The answer seemed as distant as the happiness Minji had brought back to his home. The image of Minji, frozen with the spoon in her hand, and the genuine startle in her eyes, hammered at Lee Jinwoo's mind. The brief encounter in the kitchen had been an electric shock, breaking the invisible barrier he had built between his world of observation and reality. He was no longer a passive spectator. His presence had become a disturbing force, an alien element in the harmony Minji had created. Back in his office, the screens seemed to mock him. The images of Minji and June, once a refuge for his morbid curiosity, were now a mirror of his own cowardice. He had seen the purity, the dedication, the unconditional love, and what had he done? Hidden, spied, doubted. Guilt was an overwhelming weight, and shame, a flame that burned in his chest. The days that followed were a torture. Jinwoo tried to focus on work, but every report, every email, seemed insignificant compared to the truth unfolding in his own home. He found himself looking at the clock, waiting for the moment June would return from school, eager to see what Minji would do next. It was no longer a search for flaws, but an insatiable thirst to witness kindness, to understand the source of that love she poured over his son. He watched Minji kneel to tie June's shoelaces, not in a hurry, but with patience, teaching him how to tie the knot. He watched her laugh genuinely when June told a childish joke, a sound he, the father, barely remembered hearing. She helped him with his homework, turning numbers and letters into fun games. And June, who used to hate studying, now seemed eager for those moments. Minji didn't just fulfill her obligations, she transcended them, infusing each task with a passion and affection that were almost painful to witness. The change in June was undeniable, and that was what tormented Jinwoo the most. His son, once a silent ghost wandering through the mansion, was now a vibrant child, full of curiosity and, most importantly, joy. He smiled more, spoke more, and even sought Minji's company. One afternoon, Jinwoo watched June run to Minji after a small scratch, seeking comfort in her arms, and not his father's. That scene, so simple and so devastating, pierced the last remnant of his armor. Jinwoo felt a bitter jealousy, But it wasn't a jealousy of possession. It was a jealousy of the connection, of the intimacy Min-ji had built with his son, something he, the father, had failed to maintain. He had closed himself off in his grief, and Min-ji, a stranger, had filled the void he had created. The question, "Why does she do it?" echoed in his mind, but now the answer seemed less important than the action itself. She did it because it was her essence, because it was who she was. One night, as Jinwoo watched the screens, Min-ji was in Jun's room, reading a bedtime story. Her voice was soft, melodious, and Jun, nestled in her arms, seemed completely at ease. Suddenly, Jun looked up and asked, with a child's innocence, "Min-ji, will you stay with us forever?" Jinwoo's heart stopped. He held his breath, waiting for her answer. Min-ji smiled, a sad and tender smile. "I'll stay with you, Juna, as long as you need me." She didn't promise forever, but the tenderness in her voice was a balm. Jun snuggled back in, satisfied with the answer. That question, coming from his own son, was the final blow. Jinwoo realized he could no longer hide. The truth he had discovered wasn't just about Min-ji. It was about himself, about his failure as a father, about the life he had neglected. He needed to act, not just to thank Min-ji, but to reconnect with his son, to dismantle the cameras that had turned him into a voyeur in his own life. The decision was made, but fear still gnawed at him. How would he explain the cameras? How would he apologize for his distrust? How could he, a man so accustomed to commanding and controlling, admit his vulnerability to a woman he had treated as a suspect? The tension was almost unbearable, but the image of Jun, smiling in Min-ji's arms, was a driving force more powerful than any fear. He turned off the screens. The office plunged into a silence that, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel oppressive. It was a silence of anticipation. Jinwoo stood up, his body heavy with the gravity of the decision. He knew the conversation would be difficult, perhaps painful, but it was necessary. It was the only path to redemption, to the reconstruction of his family, and perhaps to the healing of his own broken heart. He descended the stairs, each step echoing in his mind. The mansion, once a mausoleum of his grief, now seemed full of life, of laughter, of a fragile hope that Min-ji had planted. He needed to talk to her, not as a CEO, not as a secret observer, but as a father, a man who had been saved by the kindness of a stranger. The moment of truth had arrived. The silence of Jinwoo's office, once a refuge, was now an echo of his own cowardice. He had turned off the screens, but the images of Min-ji and Jun were etched in his mind, more vivid than ever. The decision had been made, but the journey to redemption seemed more arduous than any corporate negotiation. Each step he took out of the office was heavy, laden with the weight of guilt and hope. The mansion, which for so long had been a tomb of memories, now seemed to breathe. There was a faint warmth, a remnant of the life Min-ji had breathed into it. He could hear Min-ji's distant murmur tidying things downstairs, perhaps in the kitchen, perhaps in Jun's room. The sound was a beacon, pulling him towards the light, but also an alarm siren, reminding him of the abyss he had created with his distrust. He descended the stairs, the wood creaking under his feet, each sound amplified in his mind. His heart pounded, a drum in his chest, announcing the arrival of a truth he didn't know how to express. He, Lee Jinwoo, the unshakable CEO, was about to shed his armor, to expose himself to a woman he had spied on, whom he had judged unfairly. Upon reaching downstairs, he found her in the living room, folding some of Jun's freshly washed clothes. The soft light of the floor lamp illuminated her profile, and he noticed the delicacy of her movements, the concentration on her face. She was humming softly, a melody he recognized as the same one she sang to Jun. It was a scene of peaceful domesticity, one he never imagined seeing in his home. He stopped at the doorway, as so many times before, but this time there were no cameras between them. The barrier had fallen, and he stood there, vulnerable, exposed. Minji looked up, sensing his presence. Her eyes widened slightly, and the melody on her lips died. "Mr. Lee," she said, her voice a little louder than usual, surprise evident. She quickly stood up, the folded clothes still in her hands, as if she had been caught red-handed doing something wrong. Jinwoo felt a lump in his throat. The words refused to come out. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind hundreds of times, but now, before her, everything seemed to disintegrate. He couldn't start with, "I spied on you." He couldn't start with, "I doubted you." "Minji," he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. He took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between them. She instinctively took a step back, and he felt a pang of pain. He had broken the trust even before it was established. I need to talk to you," he continued, his voice a little firmer now, but still laden with an emotion he could barely contain. About everything." Minji watched him, her large, expressive eyes trying to decipher the complex expression on his face. There was apprehension there, but also a cautious curiosity. She set the clothes aside, her hands clasping nervously. "Did something happen to June?" she asked, her first concern being the boy's well-being. That simple question, that immediate priority, was a painful reminder of his own failure. "No," Jinwoo replied, shaking his head. "No, June is fine. He's sleeping." He paused, taking a deep breath, preparing for the leap into the dark. "It's about us, about me." He saw the confusion in her eyes deepen. He knew she had no idea what was coming, and that made everything even harder. "Minji," he began again, his voice almost a whisper. I made a terrible mistake." He looked at the floor for a moment, unable to meet her gaze, feeling shame burn him. "When you came here, I was in a very dark place. I had lost my wife and June. June was losing himself too. I was scared, angry, and I didn't trust you." He raised his eyes, meeting hers. They were filled with a mix of surprise and a glimpse of hurt. "I installed cameras in this house," he confessed, the words pouring out like a torrent, painful and liberating at the same time. "In almost every room I wanted to be sure you were who you said you were, that you wouldn't harm June." The air in the room seemed to solidify. Minji turned pale, and her lips parted slightly in shock. Her eyes, once merely apprehensive, were now filled with deep pain, a betrayal he could clearly see. She said nothing, but the expression on her face was more eloquent than any words. "I know," Jinwoo continued, desperate to fill the oppressive silence. "I know it's unforgivable. I know there's no excuse for what I did. I violated your privacy, your trust. I was a coward." He took another step towards her, reaching out his hand but stopped halfway, fearing she would pull away. "But I need you to know what I saw," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I saw you with June. I saw the patience, the kindness, the love you gave him. I saw you teach him to tie his shoes, to laugh at his jokes, to transform him from a silent boy into a happy child." Tears began to well up in his eyes, a strange and overwhelming sensation. He hadn't cried since his wife's funeral, but now, before Minji, the wall he had built was completely collapsing. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he continued, his voice choked. "But I needed to tell you the truth. I needed to thank you, and I need you to know that I don't want to hide anymore. I want to be a father to June. I want to be a man who trusts, and I want you to stay, not as an employee, but as part of this family, if you can forgive me." Silence returned, but this time it was a different silence. It wasn't oppressive, but laden with a fragile tension of an uncertain future. Jinwoo's tears were a testament to his transformation, but the wound he had inflicted was still open. Minji, with a heavy heart, didn't know what to say. The truth was overwhelming, and the path forward more nebulous than ever. The silence that followed Jinwoo's confession wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a vacuum, an abyss that opened between them. Minji remained motionless, the paleness on her face accentuated by the soft light in the room. Her eyes, once tearful from the emotion of his vulnerability, now fixed on Jinwoo with a complex mix of shock, hurt, and an almost physical pain. The betrayal was a blow, but the way he revealed it with such rawness and regret was something she didn't know how to process. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, cameras in almost every room, the intimacy of her moments with June, the privacy of her very existence within those walls. It had all been a sham, a spectacle for the eyes of a man who judged her in secret. The feeling was one of being invaded, violated in her deepest dignity. The warmth she felt for June, the affection she had dedicated to that house, suddenly seemed tainted, observed, analyzed. Jinwoo, still in tears, reached out his hand again, hesitant, as if seeking a touch he had no right to ask for. "Minji, please. Say something," he pleaded, his voice choked, the image of a powerful CEO completely undone. He was just a man who had made a colossal mistake, desperate for some kind of redemption. Minji finally moved, a subtle tremor running through her body. She recoiled a step, then another, as if his proximity was painful. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She was suffocated by the magnitude of the revelation. The melody she hummed for June, the innocence of her gestures, all now seemed ridiculed by the invisible lens that watched her. "Cameras," she finally whispered, her voice almost inaudible, a mere breath. It wasn't a question, but a realization, an attempt to voice the disbelief that overwhelmed her. You watched me?" The hurt in her voice was a dagger, and Jinwoo felt it pierce his own heart. "Yes," he replied, lowering his head in shame. "I know how horrible that sounds. I know there's no excuse. I was blinded by grief, by fear. I didn't trust anyone, and you were a stranger caring for my son. I didn't think straight." He raised his eyes, pleading. "But I swear, Minji, what I saw changed everything. It wasn't what I expected. I saw your kindness, your purity, your love for June. I saw that you were the only person who could reach him. I saw you heal him." He took a step forward, the urgency in his voice growing. "I'm not asking you to forgive what I did. I know it's unforgivable. But I need you to understand that I am no longer the man who installed those cameras. I am the man who turned them off, the man who cried when he saw the truth, the man who stands here before you begging for a chance to be better." Minji closed her eyes for a moment, tears finally streaming down her own cheeks. They weren't tears of anger, but of a deep sadness, of a lost innocence. It was the pain of knowing that trust, something so precious and fragile, had been broken in such a brutal way. She opened her eyes again, and in them was a determination Jinwoo hadn't seen before. "Mr. Lee," she said, her voice now firmer, though still choked, "I don't know what to say. I came here to care for June, to give him the affection he needed. I gave my best, my heart, and to know that all of it was observed, questioned, as if I were a criminal." She shook her head, the pain evident. "It's too much." She picked up June's clothes she had folded and held them against her chest, like a shield. "I understand you were suffering. I understand a father's fear, but that doesn't justify it. It doesn't justify the violation, the distrust." She looked at him, and Jinwoo saw the deepest hurt in her eyes. "I don't know if I can stay here knowing that every corner of this house might have seen me. Those words were a blow stronger than any accusation. The possibility of losing her, of losing the light she had brought to his home and to Jun's life, was unbearable. "No!" Jinwoo exclaimed, his voice almost a cry of despair. "Please don't say that. I'll remove all of them now, myself. You'll never have to worry about it again. I'll destroy them. I'll do whatever it takes for you to feel safe here again." He took another step, this time without hesitation. "I know trust is broken, and I know it will take time, perhaps a long time to rebuild it, but I'm willing to do the work. I'm willing to prove it to you. Please, Minji, think of Jun. He needs you. I need you." Minji watched him. The intensity of his plea was palpable. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine pain on his face. He wasn't just asking for forgiveness. He was begging for a second chance, not just for her, but for himself, for the family he had almost destroyed. The image of Jun, smiling and laughing with her, flashed through her mind. The boy had blossomed under her care. To leave him now, after everything, would be like abandoning a piece of her own heart. I need some time," she said, her voice weak. "I need to think. All of this it's too much for me right now." She looked at Jun's clothes in her arms. "I don't know if I can just forget. But I also don't know if I can leave." Jinwoo felt a thread of hope, fragile as a spider web, but present. She hadn't said no. She hadn't turned and left. "I understand," he said, taking a deep breath, trying to control his emotion. "I'll give you all the time you need. But please, let me start fixing this. Let me remove the cameras. Now." He gestured towards the office, then to the other rooms. "I'll start immediately, and if you decide to leave, I'll understand. But I'll fight for you, Minji. I'll fight for Jun. I'll fight for this family." Minji nodded slowly, her eyes still tearful, but with a new glimmer of consideration. The pain of betrayal was still there, but Jinwoo's vulnerability, his confession and his desperation, had opened a small crack in her resolve to leave. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, there was a possibility, however small, that the light she had brought to that house would not completely fade. The moment of truth had arrived, and with it, the promise of a battle for redemption. Jinwoo didn't wait. A man of action in his professional life, he channeled that same intensity into his desperate plea for redemption. He rushed to the office, his mind a whirlwind of shame and urgency. He knew where the monitors, the recorders, the control center of his sick surveillance were. With trembling but firm hands, he began to rip out the cables, to disconnect the devices. Each click, each tug, was a blow against the wall of distrust he had erected. The image of Minji, her eyes full of hurt, her voice broken as she whispered, "Cameras," burned in his mind. He felt her pain, as if it were his own, a self-inflicted wound. He deserved it. He deserved every ounce of scorn, of anger. But he couldn't lose her. Not after everything she had done for Jun, for him. He found the first camera in the living room, cleverly camouflaged in a corner. With a screwdriver, he unscrewed it, the small, cold lens seeming to mock his former paranoia. He held it in his palm, an insignificant object that had caused so much pain, so much violation. He smashed it against the wall, the plastic cracking, the wires snapping. It wasn't just an act of destruction, it was an exorcism. Minji, on the other side of the room, watched. She didn't move, didn't say a word, but her eyes followed Jinwoo as he moved through the house, a ghost of regret, tearing down the pillars of his own betrayal. She heard the clicks, the muffled sounds of metal and plastic breaking. Each sound was a reminder of the brutal truth, but also, perhaps, a sign of genuine effort. The pain in her chest was excruciating. It was as if a part of her had been torn away. The purity of her intention, the innocence of her affection for June, everything had been tainted by the shadow of surveillance. How could she forget? How could she trust again a man who had watched her in secret, judging her every move? But then she saw Jin Woo, the powerful CEO, now kneeling, sweating, tears still dry on his face, struggling against the stubborn screws of a hidden camera in the kitchen. He wasn't looking at her. He was focused on his task, his breathing heavy, his body trembling with effort, and she knew, with shame. It was an image of vulnerability that contrasted so violently with the imposing figure he knew. She remembered his words. "I am no longer the man who installed those cameras. I am the man who turned them off, the man who cried when he saw the truth." Could it be true? Could a man change so much? June, oblivious to the emotional storm sweeping through the house, entered the room, rubbing his eyes. "Minji Nuna," he called, his voice sleepy. He had just woken up from a nap. Minji felt a pang in her heart. The sight of June was an anchor, a reminder of why she was there, of the love she had found. She knelt down and hugged him, his clothes still clutched against her chest. "Yes, Juna, I'm here." She kissed the top of his head, smelling the child shampoo. He was her light, her reason. Jinwoo froze, hearing June's voice. He didn't want his son to see him like this, undone, destroying things. But he also needed June to see her, to feel her presence. He needed Minji to stay. He stood up, wiping his dirty hands. "Juna, you're awake," he said, trying to sound normal, but his voice was still hoarse. He looked at Minji, a silent plea in his eyes. Minji moved away from June, but kept her hand on his shoulder. "Your father is just fixing some things," she said, her voice soft, but with an edge of weariness. She couldn't lie to June, but she also couldn't explain the truth. Jinwoo nodded, grateful for her discretion. "Yes, I'm fixing some old things. They're no longer needed." He looked at Minji, trying to convey everything he felt in a single glance. Regret, gratitude, hope. "I promise, Minji, no more cameras." He returned to his work, moving to June's room, knowing there was one there too. The idea of having watched Minji and June in their most intimate space now sickened him. He ripped out the camera with controlled fury, tossing it into a bag that already held the wreckage of the others. Minji watched, her mind in a whirlwind. The sincerity of his desperation was undeniable, but the wound was deep. She felt the weight of the decision on her shoulders. To leave would mean abandoning June, the boy she had learned to love as her own son. To stay would mean trying to rebuild trust with a man who had betrayed her so intimately. She knelt in front of June. "Are you hungry, my love?" she asked, forcing a smile. She needed to be strong for him. He couldn't feel the pain she felt. June nodded, his eyes wide and innocent. "Yes, Nuna." As Minji led June to the kitchen, Jinwoo continued his crusade of destruction. He wouldn't stop until every lens, every wire, every trace of his paranoia had been eradicated. He was breaking not only the cameras, but also the man he had been, and he hoped with every fiber of his being that Minji could see this transformation, and perhaps, just perhaps, find a way to forgive him. The house, once silently observant, began to breathe again. But the air was still heavy with the dust of distrust and the fragility of hope. The path to redemption was long, and Jinwoo knew this was just the first, painful step. He had to prove to her, not just with words, but with every action, that he was worthy of her trust, worthy of her love, worthy of being a father, worthy of being a man. And Minji, amidst her pain, felt the complexity of the situation, the pull of Jun's love and the repulsion of betrayal warring within her. What would she do? The future of that family hung by a thread, and she was the one holding it. The sound of clicks and the grinding of metal filled the house. a dissonant chorus echoing the storm within Minji. Each camera ripped out, each wire cut, was an open wound and, at the same time, a desperate attempt at healing. She watched Jin-woo, the man who had been a pillar of power and authority, now kneeling, dirty, his hands trembling as he dismantled the last vestiges of his own paranoia. It was an image of humiliation, but also of a vulnerability so raw it was difficult to bear. She held June close, the warmth of his small body being her only anchor amidst the whirlwind of emotions. June's innocence was a painful contrast to the complexity of the betrayal she had just discovered. How to explain to such a pure heart that the person who loved and cared for him had been secretly watched, every laugh, every hug, every moment of tenderness recorded and analyzed. The idea sickened her. Jin-woo emerged from June's room, the plastic bag in his hand now heavy with the broken remnants of the cameras. His eyes met Minji's for an instant, a silent plea, a deep pain she could see even from a distance. He said nothing, just nodded, as if confirming the task was complete. The house, once a labyrinth of invisible eyes, now seemed empty. Not empty of life, but empty of its oppressive presence. Minji led June to the kitchen, where the morning light streamed through the windows, painting the room with a soft glow. She prepared a simple snack for the boy, her movements automatic while her mind raced in circles. The wound of betrayal was deep, a stab at the trust she had, unknowingly begun to place in Jin-woo in the security of that home. But his desperation, the way he crumbled before her, the way he destroyed the cameras with a self-directed fury, all of it was real. It was the pain of a man who had realized what he was losing. She looked at June, who chewed his toast with concentration, oblivious to everything. He was the reason she was there, the reason she hadn't simply turned and left. The love she felt for him was pure, unconditional. It was the love Jin-woo had seen through the camera lenses, the love that had broken him and, ironically, healed him. Jin-woo entered the kitchen, stopping at the doorway. He didn't approach, respecting the distance she had imposed, but his eyes never left her. He looked exhausted, not just physically, but as if the weight of his guilt had drained all the energy from his body. He had washed up, but the weariness was still etched on his face. "Minji," he began, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. I know words aren't enough. I know what I did is unforgivable, but I need you to know that there's nothing left. No lens, no wire. The house is clean." He paused, swallowing hard. "I don't know how to fix this, but I will try. I will spend the rest of my life trying." Minji didn't answer immediately. She felt June's gaze on her, the boy sensing the tension in the air, though he didn't understand the cause. She knelt in front of June, stroking his hair. "Juna, why don't you go play in your room for a bit? Nuna needs to talk to your father for a moment." June nodded, grabbing his favorite toy and running out of the kitchen. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. Minji stood up, turning to Jin-woo. Their eyes met, and the hurt in her gaze was almost palpable. "How could you, Jin-woo?" Her voice was low but laden with deep pain. "How could you watch me? How could you doubt me after everything I did for June? For this house?" Jin-woo took a step forward, his hands outstretched in a gesture of plea, but he let them drop, knowing he had no right to touch her. "I was blind, Minji. Blinded by grief, by distrust, by my own stupidity. I lost my wife and I was losing my son. I was scared. An irrational fear that led me to do something terrible. I'm not a good man. I never was." He shook his head, tears returning to his eyes. "But you showed me what it is to be good. You showed me what true love is, and I destroyed that. I destroyed the only good thing that entered my life since my wife's death." He moved a little closer, his voice choked. "I'm not asking for forgiveness now. I know it's asking too much, but I'm begging for a chance. A chance to prove that the man who installed those cameras no longer exists, that the man who saw the truth, who cried when he saw the truth, is the man standing before you now, the man who wants to fight for June, for you, for this family. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "I don't know if I can. Trust. It's like a broken mirror. It's hard to glue the pieces back together." "I know," Jinwoo said, his voice full of despair, "but I will try. I will give you space. I will give you time. I will do whatever it takes. If you want me to leave the house for a while, I will. If you want me to leave you alone, I will. But please don't take June away from me. Don't take yourself away from June." The mention of June struck a sensitive chord in Minji. She looked at the boy's bedroom door, imagining him playing, his innocent laughter. She couldn't just leave and tear June away from her life, from his father. She had promised herself she would care for him, that she would be his light. "I need time," she repeated the same phrase as before, but now with a slightly different tone. There was a hesitation, an openness that wasn't there before. "I need to think, but I won't leave today." A sigh of relief escaped Jinwoo's lips, so subtle it was almost unheard. It was a small victory, a thread of hope. He knew the path would be long, arduous and painful, but she hadn't left. She was there, hurt but still there. And that was all he could ask for now. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on hers, trying to convey all his gratitude and regret. "Thank you, Minji. Thank you for not leaving. I will prove it to you. I swear." Silence reigned again in the kitchen, but this time it wasn't a vacuum of silence, but a silence of suspension. The future of that family was still uncertain, hanging by a thin thread of hope and forgiveness. But, for the first time in a long time, the possibility of a new beginning, however fragile, seemed real. Minji still felt the pain of betrayal, but the seed of redemption had been planted. And she knew that for June, she needed to give it a chance to grow. The silence in the kitchen was a tapestry of unspoken emotions, woven with regret and fragile hope. Minji remained there, the phrase, "I won't leave today," echoing in her own mind, questioning herself. Why not? The pain of betrayal still pulsed, an open wound refusing to heal. But the image of Jinwoo, broken and humbled, begging for a chance, had struck something within her. And above all, there was June. Little June, whose laughter was the melody of that house, whose love was the sun that warmed it. How could she tear that light from his life, from his father, for her own hurt? Jinwoo nodded, but his eyes, red and swollen, still carried the weight of 1,000 apologies. He stepped back, giving her the space he had promised, but his presence still filled the room, a shadow of guilt and longing. Minji felt the need for air, for a moment to process the avalanche of emotions. She turned to the sink, beginning to wash the few dishes from June's breakfast, her movements mechanical, an attempt to anchor herself in routine while her inner world spun. Hours passed in a strange and heavy silence. Jinwoo didn't return to the kitchen. Minji could occasionally hear him upstairs, hesitant footsteps, the sound of a door opening and closing. The house, once full of invisible eyes, now seemed too empty, the absence of surveillance almost as oppressive as its presence. She prepared lunch for June, a simple pasta dish, and the boy ate with his usual enthusiasm, oblivious to the storm still hanging over the adults. While June took his afternoon nap, Minji sat in the living room, her gaze lost out the window. Trust was a broken mirror, yes, but what if the shards could be carefully collected one by one and glued back together, even if the cracks remained? She remembered how Jinwoo had refused to eat, the way he had destroyed the cameras with a fury that seemed more directed at himself than at the objects. It was the pain of a man who had hit rock bottom, who had seen the ugliness of his own actions and was genuinely terrified of the consequences. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled her from her thoughts. Jin Woo came down, dressed in casual clothes, but with a still somber expression. He carried a toolbox. His eyes met hers for an instant, a silent request for permission to exist in the same space. Minji just watched. He didn't go to the office nor to the living room. Instead, he headed to the small pantry near the kitchen, where a faucet had been dripping for weeks, a problem the former CEO in his ivory tower had never noticed or cared to fix. He knelt, opening the toolbox with a soft click. Minji watched, curious. He wasn't the kind of man who fixed things. He was the kind of man who paid for things to be fixed. But there he was, his large hands accustomed to holding pens and contracts, now manipulating screwdrivers and seals. The sound of the dripping faucet, an annoying reminder of neglect, was replaced by the clinking of metal and Jin Woo's concentrated effort. After a while, the dripping stopped. Jin Woo stood up, wiping his hands on a cloth. He looked at the faucet, then at Minji, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "It's fixed," he said, his voice still hoarse. I realize there are many things in this house I've neglected. Small things, but important ones." He didn't ask for praise, nor a smile. He just watched her, waiting for some reaction. Minji felt a lump in her throat. It was a start. A painful and uncertain start, but a start. She said nothing, but a slight nod, almost imperceptible, was her only response. It was enough for Jin Woo, a small sign that the door, though still ajar, had not been closed. He moved away again, going upstairs, leaving her alone with the silence of the repaired faucet. Minji closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The house was breathing again, yes, but so was she. And with each breath, each small gesture, the complexity of the situation deepened. She was caught between the pain of betrayal and the strange, almost frightening attraction to Jin Woo's vulnerability, to the man he was trying to become. The path to forgiveness was long, but the path to indifference suddenly seemed even more distant. She found herself watching him, no longer with the repulsion of betrayal, but with the caution of one who seeks truth in every movement, in every silence. The tension didn't lessen, it only changed form, from an explosive confrontation to a silent observation, laden with expectations and fears. The future of that family still hung by a thread, but now the thread seemed to be carefully and painfully repaired. The silence of the repaired faucet was a strange reminder. It wasn't just the sound that had disappeared, but the constant irritation, the neglect it represented. Minji remained in the living room, the almost imperceptible nod still weighing on her conscience. It was a small gesture, yes, but the image of Jin Woo kneeling, his large, powerful hands awkwardly manipulating tools, was hard to erase. He was trying. The phrase echoed in her mind, a dissonant melody with the pain of betrayal. She remembered how he had destroyed the cameras, the fury in his eyes, not of anger, but of self-loathing. It was the pain of a man who had hit rock bottom, who had seen the ugliness of his own actions and was genuinely terrified of the consequences. It was the pain she herself felt, but for different reasons. The afternoon dragged on at a slow and heavy pace. June woke from his nap, and Minji took him to the garden, trying to find refuge in the simplicity of the grass and the sun. She needed air, space, time to process the avalanche of emotions. But even outside, Jin Woo's shadow lingered, the awareness of his presence in the house, of his silent struggle. As evening fell, June's routine began. Bath, dinner, bedtime story. Minji was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard hesitant footsteps on the stairs. Jin Woo came down, but instead of heading to his office or the living room, he stopped at the kitchen entrance. His eyes met hers, a silent plea, a non-verbal question. I can help with dinner?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. It was the first time he had offered help with something so mundane. Minji hesitated. The idea of having him so close, in her space, was uncomfortable, but the sincerity in his eyes was palpable. "You don't have to," she replied, her voice firmer than she expected. "I can manage." He nodded, subtle disappointment on his face. "I understand, but if you need anything, please tell me." He turned, but instead of going upstairs, he sat at the kitchen table, a respectful distance away. He didn't pick up his phone, nor a book. He just sat, watching her, his presence a silent force. Minji felt a strange warmth creep up her neck. It was hard to ignore him, hard to maintain the facade of indifference. She continued to chop vegetables, her movements a little faster, a little tenser. With every sound of the knife on the cutting board, she felt his gaze on her. It was different from the surveillance of the cameras. This was a look of regret, of longing. When dinner was ready, June ran to the table, his eyes shining. Jin-woo stood up, pulling out June's chair, a gesture Minji had never seen him make. He sat beside his son, and for the first time, there was no invisible barrier between them. He talked with June about his day at school, about the drawings he had made, about his toys. Minji watched, her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. It was a different father, a present father. After dinner, it was time for June's bath. Minji was about to take him when Jin-woo stepped forward. Can I give him a bath today?" he asked. His voice still hesitant, but with a tone of determination. "I've never done it before, but I want to learn. I want to be a part of it." Minji stared at him. It was a bold request. It was sacred territory, the intimacy of a child's bath. But the expression on his face was so genuine, so full of a desire for redemption, that she couldn't refuse. "All right," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But be careful. The water can't be too hot, and he doesn't like soap in his eyes." Jin-woo nodded vigorously, his eyes full of gratitude. He picked June up, the boy laughing, oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. Minji followed him to the bathroom, watching from the doorway. He was clumsy, yes. He almost dropped the soap, and the water splashed a little more than necessary. But he was there, with June, laughing with him, rinsing his hair with a tenderness Minji never imagined he possessed. She remembered the camera footage, the images of June laughing in her arms, of her own voice singing to him. Now it was Jin-woo who was there, and June's laughter was even louder, fuller of joy. A pang of something that wasn't jealousy, but a strange mix of relief and renewed pain hit Minji. He was finally seeing what she saw, feeling what she felt. But why did it take so long? Why did it require such a profound betrayal to open his eyes? When Jin-woo brought June out of the bath, wrapped in a fluffy towel, the boy was radiant. "Daddy gave me a bath," he exclaimed, looking at Minji with pride. Jin-woo smiled at June, then at Minji, a tired but genuine smile. "He's a good boy," he said, his voice soft. I didn't know how much I was missing." Minji didn't answer. She picked June up, starting to dress him, but her eyes met Jin-woo's for an instant. There was a new depth there, a silent understanding that hadn't existed before. The broken mirror was still there, but perhaps, just perhaps, some of the shards were beginning to fit together, revealing a distorted but real image of what could be. That night, as Minji put June to sleep, singing a lullaby, she could hear Jin-woo downstairs. There was no sound of a TV nor music, just silence. He was there, present but invisible. The tension hadn't diminished, but it had transformed. It was no longer the tension of anger, but the tension of expectation. The expectation of a new day, of new gestures, of an uncertain path towards a forgiveness she still didn't know if she could give. The future of that family still hung by a thread, but now the thread seemed to be carefully and painfully repaired, one gesture at a time. The next morning arrived with a soft light, but the atmosphere in the house was still dense, laden with the echoes of the previous night's gestures. Minji woke before the sun, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Jun's smile as his father bathed him. Jinwoo's clumsy tenderness, the silent confession that he had lost so much. All of this mingled with the vivid memory of the cameras, of the invasion, of the pain of betrayal. Forgiveness seemed a distant mirage, but indifference, once a shield, was now crumbling into pieces. When she went down to the kitchen, she expected to find the usual silence, perhaps Jinwoo already in his office, immersed in his business world. Instead, the smell of fresh coffee hung in the air, and the soft clinking of ceramics came from the counter. Jinwoo was there, standing, wearing an apron that looked ridiculously large on his body, trying, with an almost painful concentration, to prepare toast and eggs. He looked like a general trying to decipher a complex battle map, but instead of armies, he was dealing with a frying pan. He looked up when Minji entered, a blush creeping up his neck. "Good morning," he said, his voice a little firmer than the night before, but still with a hint of uncertainty. I thought I'd make breakfast today. For June, and for you." He gestured to the table where two places were set with a third, smaller one for June. It was simple, but the effort was evident. The eggs were a bit overcooked, and the toast slightly burnt at the edges, but the intention was clear. Minji felt a lump in her throat. It was another gesture, another attempt to insert himself into the routine she had built alone, with so much effort. "You didn't have to," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible. "I know," he replied without looking away. "But I wanted to. I want to be a part of it, of everything." Jun came down the stairs a moment later, his eyes widening at the sight of his father in the kitchen. "Daddy's making breakfast," he exclaimed, running to the table. The joy on his face was contagious, and Minji felt a pang in her chest. It was the happiness she had always wanted for June, the presence of a father. But at what cost? Breakfast was a strange event. Jinwoo tried to talk with Jun, asking questions about his toys and drawings, and the boy responded with enthusiasm. Minji ate in silence, observing the interaction, the family dynamic that was forming before her eyes. It was a picture she never imagined. The distant CEO, the man who barely noticed his son's existence, was now there, clumsy but present. After breakfast, Jinwoo insisted on taking June to school. "I can do this," he said, his eyes fixed on Minji's. It's the least I can do." Minji hesitated, but the silent plea in his eyes and June's hopeful gaze made her yield. She watched from the doorway as Jinwoo held June's hand, the two walking together down the sidewalk, the tall and once imposing figure now seeming a little more vulnerable, a little more human. The house fell silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was a silence filled with the absence of Jinwoo and June, but also with the presence of their recent memories. Minji cleaned the kitchen, her movements mechanical, her mind still spinning. He was trying, yes, but the wound was still deep. The cameras, the violation of her trust, the feeling of having been judged and distrusted. How do you erase that? Later, Jinwoo returned, his expression more serious. He didn't go to the office. Instead, he sat in the living room, where she was folding clothes. He watched her for a long time before speaking. "Minji," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper, "I know what I did is unforgivable. I'm not asking you to forgive me now. I'm just asking you to allow me to try to be the father June deserves. To try to be the man I should have been from the start." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I saw the recordings. I saw how you cared for him, how you loved him. I saw the truth I was too blind to see, and I hated myself for it. I hate myself for doubting you, for treating you with so much distrust." His eyes were red, but he didn't cry. It was a more contained, deeper pain. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm willing to try. For June, for you, for us. Minji stopped folding the clothes, her hands trembling slightly. His words were sincere, she could feel it, but sincerity didn't erase the pain. Jin-woo, she said, her voice choked. You can't just erase what happened. It's not a switch you turn on and off. I trusted you, and you broke me. You broke the trust I had in you, and in myself. She stood up, walking to the window, looking at the garden where she and June spent so many hours. I saw what you did. I saw you break the cameras. I saw your pain. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with the man you're trying to be, when the man you were hurt me so deeply. She turned to face him, her eyes tearful. June deserves a father. Yes, and he's happy with you now. And that breaks my heart in a way you can't imagine. Because I want him to be happy. But I also need to protect myself. I need to protect what's left of me. Jinwoo listened to her in silence, her every word feeling like a blow. I understand, he said, his voice hoarse. I don't expect it to be easy. I don't expect it to be fast. But please, Minji, don't give up on me. Don't give up on us. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging. Silence filled the room again, heavy and laden. Minji looked at him, at the genuine vulnerability in his eyes, at the man who stood there, stripped of his arrogance and power. It was an image that confused her, that attracted and repelled her at the same time. The path to forgiveness was a long and winding road, and she still didn't know if she had the strength to walk it. But the door, though still ajar, had not been closed. And with each new gesture, each new word, each gesture, the complexity of her feelings deepened, tying them in a knot that seemed impossible to untie, but which, strangely, kept them connected. The tension didn't lessen, it only transformed from an explosive confrontation to a silent observation, laden with expectations and fears. The future of that family still hung by a thread, but now the thread seemed to be carefully and painfully repaired, one gesture at a time, one word at a time, in the hope that one day it could become strong enough to bear the weight of what was to come. The tear that streamed down Minji's face that night wasn't one of deep sadness, nor of burning anger. It was the weight of everything. The exhaustion of fighting her own feelings, the confusion of seeing a man so transformed, and the small, almost imperceptible pang of a hope she didn't dare to name. The knot that bound them seemed impossible to untie, but it was precisely this complexity that kept them strangely connected. The days stretched into a tapestry of small, significant gestures. Jinwoo continued his journey of redemption with a persistence that at times irritated Minji, but mostly disarmed her. He not only deactivated and removed the cameras, but also made sure Minji witnessed the process, as if each cut wire was a piece of the distrust he was trying to eradicate. He didn't force conversation, but was always present, a silent and attentive shadow. Minji watched him. She watched him read to June, his deep, calm voice filling his son's room. She watched him awkwardly trying to fix a broken toy, his brow furrowed in concentration. She watched him in the kitchen, where his eggs were still a disaster and his toast, at times a little more than crispy, but where he toiled with an almost touching dedication. Each of these moments was another layer in the complexity of her feelings. June's happiness was Minji's balm and torture. To see the boy laugh with his father, run into his arms after school, share his small secrets and victories, was everything she had always wanted for him. But this joy came with a cost, a constant reminder of what she had lost, what he had broken, and the difficult choice that now hung over her. She felt divided, one part of her wanting to embrace this new reality for June's sake, another part still wounded, fearing the vulnerability of opening herself up again. One night, the routine was broken. June woke up with a high fever, whimpering and calling for "Mommy!" Minji rushed to the room, her heart aching. She picked him up, feeling the feverish heat of his body. As she tried to calm him, Jinwoo appeared at the door, his face etched with worry. His eyes met Minji's, and for the first time in a long time, there was no tension, only shared concern. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "Fever," Minji replied, already grabbing the thermometer. "He's very hot." Jinwoo approached. His hand hesitated for a moment, then touched Jun's forehead. "We need to give him the medicine." They worked together, wordlessly, but with a synchronicity that surprised Minji. She prepared the medicine. He brought a damp towel for Jun's forehead. He held the boy while Minji made him drink the syrup, his eyes fixed on his son, genuine concern etched on his face. The arrogant CEO was no more, only a frightened father. Hours passed. They took turns caring for Jun, monitoring his temperature, changing the compresses. Minji watched Jinwoo briefly fall asleep in the armchair beside Jun's bed, exhausted, but still holding his son's small hand. It was an image that struck her deeply. It was the image of a father, not of a man who had betrayed her, but of someone who loved his son with the same intensity she did. When Jun finally fell asleep, his fever subsiding a little, Minji and Jinwoo met in the kitchen, the silence of dawn hanging over them. Minji prepared an herbal tea, and Jinwoo just watched her, the exhaustion in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse, breaking the silence, "for taking care of him, for everything." Minji just nodded, serving the tea. "He's my son too, Jinwoo." The word son sounded strange on her lips, a truth she had always felt, but rarely verbalized in his presence. He took the cup, his hands brushing hers for an instant. A shiver ran through Minji. "I know," he replied, his eyes fixed on hers, the vulnerability still present, but now mixed with deep gratitude. "And I don't know what I would have done without you tonight, without you in general." The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was a silence of understanding, of a temporary truce in their emotional battle. That night, amidst the concern for Jun, Minji's defenses had softened, just a little. She saw the man he was striving to be, the father Jun needed, and the complexity of her own feelings deepened even further. The path to forgiveness was still a long and winding road, but in that early morning, under the faint kitchen light, Minji felt that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a thin thread of hope for them, not for romance, not for an easy return, but for the possibility of building something new from the rubble, something that could sustain Jun's happiness and, who knows, the peace of mind for both of them. The tension hadn't disappeared, but had transformed into a delicate dance of caution and a growing, albeit reluctant, acceptance.